So I'm pleased to now introduce our third panel of the day, this one focused on health innovation policy and regulating novel technology. This panel will be moderated by Neil Flanswright. Neil is Executive Chairman of Cantex Pharmaceuticals, a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on developing and commercializing proprietary compounds that enhance the efficacy and safety of the treatment of cancer and blood disorders. Neil was previously Vice Chairman and President of IVAX Corporation until it was sold to Teva Pharmaceuticals in 2006. Before that, Neil served as Senior Vice President and Chief Counsel at Syntex Corporation, where he was a member of its executive and operating committees prior to its sale to Roche in 1994. He was an early investor and early member of the board of directors of Chipotle Mexican Grill and is currently its lead independent director. He's also lead independent director of Equity One and a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. In fall 2012, Neil was appointed by Dean Minow as an expert in residence at the Harvard iLab, or the Innovation Lab. So Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Holly. It's now my pleasure to introduce our very distinguished panel. I'm going to start with Ben Rowan. Ben is currently Assistant Professor of Technological Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Strategic Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Ben's work focuses on patent law, biopharmaceutical innovation, and government regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. Melissa Wasserman is currently professor and Richard Nan Stockton Faculty Scholar at the University of Illinois College of Law. In the fall, she will be moving to the University of Texas at Austin. Melissa's research focuses on the institutional design of innovation policy, with a particular emphasis on patent law and administrative law. Nicholson Price is currently assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire School of Law, and in the fall will become assistant professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Nicholson writes on incentives and innovation in the life sciences, including the pharmaceutical industry, genetics, and personalized medicine. Timo Minson is associate professor in the Center for Information and Innovation Law at the University of Copenhagen. Timo's research concentrates on intellectual property, competition, and regulatory law, with a special focus on emerging technologies in the pharma, life science, and biotech sectors. And Rachel Sachs is an academic fellow at the Petrie Flom Center. And in the fall, she will become an assistant professor at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. Rachel's research interests lie at the intersection of patent law and health law, with a particular focus on problems of innovation and access, where patent law intersects with drug reimbursement policies. By the way, all of our panelists have been academic fellows at the Petrie Flom Center, except for Timo, who was a Petrie Flom visiting scholar. And now I'm going to turn to our questions. The first question, not to fear, the first question, I can pick it up. The first question is, how is innovation policy for health technology special? Or is it? I'm going to throw this open to the whole panel, but I will, if I don't receive a volunteer quickly, I will designate someone to respond first.
Looks like I should start.
Okay.
So, so I don't know what special means. It's different in that, like, areas of each area of the economy, each area of innovation is different in its own ways. The health sector is different in that it's highly regulated through its own specific channels. So there's lots of specific regulations in that space, and you can use regulation in kind of a very broad sense. Like, there's the medical profession, which is its own institution that has its own norms and rules, and that just sort of makes it different from a lot of other areas. It's interesting in that it's just a huge portion of the economy. Is it like 20%, 25% of GDP or something like that? It's just huge. It's sort of an interesting area to study because it covers a really wide range of different types of innovation. So you have everything from the development of new molecular entities, which are among like the sort of the longest time to market, most expensive innovations that we as a society create on the one hand. On the other hand, you have things like drug tests for workplace our employees using narcotics, which you've like just a much or very different type of innovation, and different regulatory setups for all these different types of products. And so on that front, it's a fascinating place to study.
Yeah, so I would just add a few things, and I obviously agree with what Ben said, but when I think of it from medical innovation, and if you're trying to optimize medical innovation in any sort of innovation policy, you think of both trying to promote innovation, but also minimizing the sort of costs that the tools to promote innovation may put on society. So if you think of patents, we essentially give a time-limited monopoly in order to allow inventors to recoup their R&D investment, but it imposes costs on society. We have limited access. We may have to pay a higher price. And when you think about all of the regulatory overlays and how an insurance all interacts, it's a very complex aspect, I think, of medical innovation to try to do that optimization, and more complex perhaps in other areas where you don't have as much FDA regulatory aspects and the insurance aspect, where in most markets we may think the prices that people pay for goods will tell us something about how much they want it, where I think health insurance makes it much more difficult because we're not paying the full price.
Yes, just to pick up on what Melissa just said, it's hard to imagine any other field where to develop a product takes as long. I'm speaking as an industry person. It can be up to 20 years. The burdens of getting a product approved, or to demonstrate that it works so anyone would want to buy it to begin with, it's a huge process. And the fact that you need government permission to sell it, not too many industries have that. So it's a strange animal. I'm sorry.
I was just going to follow up with what you said. In that, health the technology is a weird area because the market's just so broken. In an area that the market is not broken in a lot of other areas of society, you can make a guess at least that market price is going to be some vaguely reasonable aggregator of social preference, maybe, and that you'll get some sort of competition in health that's just so false. The competition's crazy. Market price has very little to do with social value. Everything's screwed up. There's no consumer. So trying to figure out how innovation should work in this area is really weird, but also really important because health is a big deal.
It's another difference.
Yeah.
It's a matter of life and death. Maybe other products can sometimes reach that, but this reaches it just about all the time.
Yes.
So,
well, you took the words out of my mouth. I agree with my colleagues. It's a very special area. It's a weird animal, and you can also see that already if you look at the Hatch-Waxman Act, that it is special. Also, the ethical dimension is, of course, very clear in this area. If you do mistakes, if you mess up, both on the regulatory field, on the innovation field, it can actually kill people. It can lead to a situation where you don't have sufficient antibiotics available and so on. So in this area, and also it's also exciting because of the paradigm shift that we see right now from the traditional open-closed innovation system in the area to the open approaches where the lines are blurring and where also actually the health system is mixing up with issues that we know from the ICT sector. So all of this is very interesting, I think.
And to build on these very helpful responses, the fact that health innovation policy is so cross-disciplinary, that it involves thinking about not just patent law, but also, Neil, as you said, food and drug regulations, about healthcare regulations, it means it's much more challenging to study it in some ways, but there are also a lot more opportunities. So we think about patent law as being really tough to tailor to particular kinds of technologies, but maybe we can more easily tailor food and drug regulation or health law to meet the needs of innovation policy in this particular field.
Because it is such a regulated, legislated field. It's hard, again, to think of any other products that are such a focus of public attention. That doesn't mean we get it right, but everybody spends a lot of time thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So moving along, because we have a lot of questions. The second question is, how or in what particular areas does innovation policy for health technology intersect with other aspects of health law? And the suggestions are, for example, healthcare finance and bioethics. Anyone want to try that one?
I can start on this end, maybe we can go back.
Good.
So we've had a lot of conversations today about whether healthcare law is law of the horse, and we can all see what we want to in it. So in my mind, there are ways in which almost every doctrine in health law can be traced in some way to innovation. So one I've been studying lately, and Einar mentioned this earlier, is about insurance, right? When we think about paying for drugs, paying for health technologies, that's about access, but it's also about innovation. When we decide that we're going to pay for something, either when Medicare passes Part D, right, pharmaceutical companies know that there's a much bigger, different market for their products than they did previously, and they change their behavior accordingly. So there's a lot we can do thinking about just insurance and what we pay for.
Yes, I would add to that also that you can not only see it on the national level, because access to healthcare is not only access to healthcare in industrialized countries, also in the developing world, where India, for example, is enforcing very innovative interpretation of the TRIPS agreement to grant access to its population, thereby undermining some previously established principles in patent law. And there I think we also have a link to how much responsibility should be put on the government, on the insurance system, and what can be solved within patent law. Because for some problems, patent law was never created to solve these problems. So there we have, I think, a clear issue. Then, of course, also that the issue of ethics in the patent examination procedure in Europe, there's a clear overlap where we have to consider the moral exclusion in European patent law for example, embryonic stem cell technology and germline modifications, just to mention a few. So this is an area, and also where the areas are overlapping is where the regulatory system can provide incentives together with insurance system, with the tax system, with governmental involvement and prices for incentivizing technologies where the patent system simply does not work. And that is, of course, often drugs, antibiotics, these areas.
Just pick up on that. One of the things, sometimes when we're talking about all the other things, we don't mention it really costs a lot of money to develop these drugs. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I don't pretend I know all other industries, but it's pretty vast. And it's not just if you take any successful drug and some big company will tell you it costs $2.6 billion, but think of all the failed drugs. The amount of money that's spent in pharmaceutical research in any year by all the different private, putting aside government spending and university spending, but if you were just focused on a private, and that means somebody had to invest that money. So to create a system that incentivizes private investors to support all that research so that we one day can have the next cancer drug or Alzheimer's drug or cardiovascular drug. It's a complicated system. All these pieces have to work or else we don't have new drugs.
I just add, I think also what is often overseen is that we need a sustainable system. We have to think 20, 40 years ahead, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if we could get rid of patent law in certain areas, we would have perfect access for a couple of years. But the risk is that the technological well is running dry. So that is also absolutely right.
So I agree with that. There's certainly obviously it's big point of patents is to drive a bunch of stuff. But I think another area that this intersects with is not just the cost of development, but the cost to society of buying this stuff. And I think some of the interesting research that's going on here is how the incentives that we set for development are often really lousily aligned with the incentives for what we want for society. I mean, so Ben's done some awesome work in this area with Heidi Williams and Eric Budish about kind of, why is it that we get so much investment in drugs that we get so little bang for our buck? And it's because the way we set up the system, not to steal your thunder, is that those are the ones where you get a ton of money. And we do a great job of incentivizing companies to develop really expensive, really new drugs, really cool technologies that make very marginal differences to health, but that we spend a ton of money for. And so I think on the kind of cost side, we've also got examples of really expensive drugs that are just amazing, like Sovaldi, cures Hep C, awesome. But we just do a really bad job of integrating kind of the healthcare cost side with how do we set up innovation in a way that we get good stuff.
I'll give you my little take on that. My take is, again, I speak from an industry perspective. I think you're right. So why is so much money spent on drugs that produce such a little difference? The answer is not the normal marketplace. People pay for innovation and something that really helps them, not for. It's largely related to the amount of advertising that they selling these little marginal differences, and it's television advertising of drugs, and the amount of advertising is really a negative. If we were really to let the physicians determine which of the drugs that we should prescribe because they really add value, you would see less of that. I think the differences in this latest ulcer drug, Prilosec compared to Nexium, that is a waste of money, and it's all driven by advertising, I think. But just an industry thing.
I mean, the one thing I would say is, and Rachel touched on this, is it is very complex, but it also gives us a lot of different policy levers that we can utilize to tailor innovation better, right? And patents are a hard one, I think, to tailor at the sort of level that we're talking about, and thinking about the FDA, data exclusivities, as Ben and some other people have written about, give us a way that we may be able to get a better sort of adjustment for things that we may think give us a bigger social value.
Yeah, so I would sort of throw in two things. One of them is just a different way of saying what I think a lot of people have already said, which is there's a very fundamental tension between the objective of the patent system and the way in which, the core way in which we encourage the development of a lot of new medical technologies, and that's by allowing people, once they develop them and they're successful, to charge a bunch of money for them, and the objective throughout a lot of health policy, which is to reduce costs, to make the system affordable. And those things just operate in tension, and you see it all the time, right? So there's there's a resolution in the sense that ex ante you sit there and you think, well, what would we want the optimal system to look like? But ex post, it's constantly in conflict. You have an expensive new drug, and people say, oh, it's too expensive. But it's like the fact that it's expensive is part of the system's design. Like, we literally designed the system for that drug to be expensive. That's how it functions. But maybe it's too expensive, and there's a sort of question of, are there defects in the market and the way things are set up where it's not that it's expensive, but like there's something going wrong where the price is too high. And frequently I've found that the conversations along this, including within academia, have sort of fallen short of being really clear in identifying what that market failure is. Which is not to say it's not there. Like, you can think of a gazillion, but we're not particularly good at laying that out carefully and thinking through, like, what are the flaws, which is important because oftentimes we want to intervene. And if you want to intervene, you want to think, well, what's going wrong? The other, but there's one other thing I would throw in, which is that there's another area of tension that I'm sort of aware of, and that's in the regulation of medical products, where the core objective we have in the way we regulate medical products is mostly about safety. That's most of what the system is designed for. But very quickly, as we sort of implemented these systems, it became clear that those regulations were also having a huge effect on innovation incentives, we kept talking about. And so, and that actually sets up a different set of goals that can conflict at times, because you can have a system where, we're imposing safety regulations on a particular line of products, and one effect of those regulations is that there's stuff that we think that might be valuable that just isn't getting developed because there isn't a good pathway to market. It's just not profitable. And you might think, well, look, if it's just not getting to market, maybe we should relax those safety regulations and see what happens. But like, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe like there's a good reason for those to be in place. And like that, I think that actually happens a lot. And you can think of lots of different examples where that sort of stuff's happening. So that's another area in which there's interaction between innovation policy and health and other the sort of regulatory objectives.
So it's very stimulating. I have two quick thoughts before we move on. One is, the tension of safety. One of the places that I'm always shocked as a person developing cancer drugs is we're talking about terminal illnesses, and they're requiring us to do placebo controls and endless safety tests. It makes no sense. Terminal patients or a patient with Alzheimer's does not want to wait till you prove it's absolutely safe. So there's a misfocus on that. And we could narrow that tension by saying safety is important in these areas, less so in these. That's a discrimination that is very hard for the FDA to make. As far as pricing, I want to just go back to you saying some of the drugs are just too expensive. Well, I mean, we have so many counter systems. First of all, recently there was a case of a very high expensive drug, and another innovative came along in the same field, and the purchasers, the large chains and hospital buying groups had enough purchasing power to say, I'm going to buy the cheaper one, and suddenly all the prices came down. But the actual time to develop a drug is so long, and patents only last 20 years from the first filing. They don't have that many years. If you don't give the promise of a very high price for some of these, if the drug doesn't work or doesn't add anything, there won't be a market. That's going to die. But for drugs that do really contribute something, they may need a very high price because very soon after their launch, it's a relatively few years, the competition, whether it's generics, it's biosimilars, it's the paragraph 4 challenges to their patents. If you don't offer investors the opportunity for some very high prices, you're not going to see some of these very innovative new drugs that really advance safety and health. But moving to the next question, what are some of the key levers for influencing innovation for health technology? Patents, payer innovation, insurance?
Do you want to
I
start?
can
or-
start. Do you want to start? Okay,
Go
I'll
ahead.
start. So I think up here you have a particularly selected group of scholars in that we all tend to look beyond just patent law and thinking about innovation incentives. So we do all think about things like FDA exclusivity periods or insurance, as I was mentioning, or what?
Or EMA.
Yeah, or administrative levers. So we do all think about these different aspects. I will plug for some recent scholarship that's being done on sort of non-legal levers, things like social norms of scientists working together. So Amy Kopczynski has this new paper about the influenza surveillance network and the ways in which scientists work together to make that work every year, not just over a period of a very long time.
Well, there's a great array of mechanisms that we can use, both push and pull mechanisms. And it is very much dependent on which sector we're looking on, right? Mm-hmm. And some sectors, like, for example, in the antibiotics area, we need integrated approaches, right? Because even if you would have a strong market exclusivity system, you would have the problem that you still need to guarantee that the antibiotics are not sold like Coca-Cola, because mm-hmm. that would enhance then the development of antibiotic resistance. So you need somehow these conservative approaches linked to some incentives that are not necessarily patent-based. And when it comes to the access question, I agree with you, sometimes the high price is necessarily, but when does the price become excessive? So what we also need is transparency. And how to balance more transparency, because we also need secrecy in some areas, so we need the possibility to keep some know-how secret, to not kill the innovation system. So we need both. And that is also one of the major challenges that we're facing right now. And I guess also in the pre-innovation area, we need standards. And we need to see how standards interrelate with IPRs and with competition law. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, also very important.
Any thoughts? Nicholas?
So I think we've kind of covered, or we've covered a bunch of the kind of becoming more standard toolkit of various different ways that you can throw money at the problem, either through various different types of exclusivity on the back end, and there are also, here grants or prizes or tax incentives on the front end, and so there's let's throw money at a problem so that we can take an expensive problem and give people money so they'll be willing to solve it. I think there's also, and this is, I think, it gets subject of a little bit less focus, how do we make the problem cheaper? So not throw money at it, but make it an easier problem to solve so that it's less expensive in the first place. And there, I think government does some kind of interesting things already in terms of developing infrastructure, bringing together stakeholders from different area with different expertise, things like the Sentinel system, the personalized medicine or precision medicine initiative, and the idea of this 1 million-person cohort, the kind of things that make innovation easier are, I think, a different set of policy levers. And they kind of on the flip side of the problem. So I would like to see a little bit more attention paid to those, and I think there's a bunch of stuff going on, but there could be more on that side as well.
Ben?
So there's lots of stuff because this sort of comes up just by the nature of the first question, which is this is a highly regulated industry. It's like there's sort of regulations going on at every step of the way, which means there's avenues to intervene at every step of the way. So there's some that we don't talk about as much, but might be really important. So the way in which we deal with and encourage or don't entrepreneurship in this space, the financing of new developments. So we probably should be thinking a little bit more about patient involvement in the innovation process, which is important for clinical trial. There's sort of this endless set of other things, but I think a lot of the people on this panel started out kind of with this interest in patent law and biopharmaceutical innovation, and all of us ended up in the same place, which is thinking about patent law, but also thinking about other stuff.
Well, it's not entirely, these are not independent things. There's an endogeneity problem, right? In that all of us, I think, learned a fair bit from you, and you started out in that place.
Yes,
Ben's
right.
my
Maybe not
patent law
Timo as much.
professor, I have to
Maybe that's
say.
just me, I don't know.
Right, yes.
I take 1 second to mention some negative levers. We're talking about ways to stimulate the process, but things that have always seemed to me that harm the whole process, innovation, are one, when congressional committees beat up on the FDA. If there are mistakes, will happen.
Yeah.
It is absolutely counterproductive. They go back and they feel risk averse. It's so easy to grandstand. So if someone ought to really give them a message, stop doing that. The second thing is political rhetoric in this election season, when a lot of the candidates, Hillary, Bernie, Donald, all said something about pharmaceutical pricing. I can speak for myself. What happened? 50% drop in market valuations of all biotech companies, and complete shutdown of biotech IPOs. I was in the middle of one, dead on the spot. Hillary spoke, and everyone agreed with her. Completely wrong. I mean, one of the ways we have to communicate is what maybe it is correct that what Valiant and Shkreli were doing is abominable and they should go to jail. And in fact, there probably are laws permitting that right now. But it didn't have anything to do with innovative drugs. And we have to stop this kind of stuff, because the core of all this, or one of the drivers, is private funding of investment in healthcare, and we don't want to kill it for no reason. Oh, I'm sorry for the distraction, but question 4. What are the biggest missed opportunities in innovation policy as applied to health? For example, incentives to develop new therapeutic uses for existing products. That was the first question. There is a second part. What are we doing well? But let's talk about what are the missed opportunities first.
So I could list off a bunch of things I've written about. So instead of doing that, I'll quickly summarize that and then talk about other stuff that I have not yet written about. So the stuff that I've written about has been sort of dysfunction inside the patent system, the way it works, that I think are problems that are easy to fix. So I think they're low-hanging fruit. And the quick summary of it is just that the way the patent system works is it targets and rewards the discovery of new drugs. And that's not really what we need to be doing so much. What we need to be doing is rewarding and encouraging the development of new drugs, a thing that really is hard to do, that sort of drives the need for protection and the big cost, has to do with things like clinical trials, so these huge upfront investments. And the system just isn't designed that way. And so there's lots of stuff that, the problem works along multiple fronts. So you've got stuff that we don't need further development in, and sometimes you can get a patent on it, and that's what we call like bad evergreening. But it also actually works the other way, where you've got stuff that we need someone to fund clinical trials on, and they won't because the drug's not patentable anymore, or the clinical trials are going to take a long time, as you were mentioning, and so you're going to burn through all your patent life before you actually get on the market, and so you won't do it. But that's like the stuff where you need need the most protection because it's such a big investment. And then new uses for old drugs where, it's a little less of a patent problem than it is a patent enforcement problem, and that seems solvable because it's just a question of can third parties observe what the prescribed indication is, and the answer is yes, because that's what insurance companies do. It's called prior authorization. So we kind of have a system in place that could allow that kind of stuff to happen. I think there's a bunch of other things we need to be paying attention to too. So the wearable health space, I've just been paying attention and noticing, like we're kind of watching this slow motion little catastrophe happening where we're developing all this wearable technology, which seems like it could be an amazing boon for diagnostics, right? So that basically people could have these important diagnostics just wearing them all the time, and yet all the companies in this space, the major ones, so Apple, Fitbit, whatever, they're all staying away from medicine, so medical device diagnostics with a 10-foot pole. They're just not willing to touch it. And we know the reason why. The reason why is that their business cycle is totally incompatible with sort of the FDA cycle. They cannot sort of have a system where they create a new product, and instead of launching it right away, they have to go through 2 years of testing. Like every time they do an update on their product, they've got another 2 years of testing. Like that just doesn't work with that product. So we're just not going to get the diagnostic for the wearables. That seems like a disaster. But that's the train we're on right now, and there's no even talk about getting off that train, which is so fascinating. And as mentioned,
It sounds like an opportunity for someone to take a license to their technology and use it, not in a glamorous and a beautiful watch, but something that would work only medically and look more diagnostic, but that you'd wear on you.
Yeah, so that'll be the business. The problem is that so if in order to sort of have your product updated, it takes you 2 years as opposed to the Apple Watch, it's just hard to compete. So what you end up having is rapid evolution of the hardware technology and some of the apps and sort of stuff on the consumer side, whereas on the healthcare side, things are going to go at a crawl, which is what we sort of demand with the FDA. And so we probably just need to think more carefully about so if you just sort of do a small software update to your Apple Watch, do you really need to go through the whole FDA process again with a thing? Or we should probably think more carefully about what are the changes in product design that require going through the whole process again, because it just may not be optimal for the demand.
In terms of a 510K, which is if it's close enough to something already on the market, there might be, if you just liberally interpret existing regulations and think of it as a medical device, it might.
Yeah, so there might be, and that's going to require some entrepreneurship on risk taking on the side of these tech companies, which they're not used to doing. And one of the things is that you just see the split between the companies that do consumer tech and the companies that do medical devices. They're like radically different business models. The staff, the people who run them, the way in which they're like everything's very different. And so I think that's a big problem. I'll skip the other thing because I've talked for too long.
No, but thank you.
No, I mean, and to further it, I think with the patents, something you mentioned is the timing aspect with them, right? You get them so early in the clinical trials, you have such a few years left, all the sort of issues that are concerned with evergreening additional patents, thinking about using the FDA data exclusivities to promote innovation more like we're doing in the biosimilar regime, and especially with the Federal Circuit's sort of opinion that's decoupled the sort of patent dance, right, from the biosimilar and data exclusivity. I think it'll be interesting to see if that ends up functioning, or we think promoting innovation in a better than we've seen historically with the Hatch-Waxman overlay in small molecules.
Although, I would just put it at my previous company at IVAX, we knocked out the patents because of paragraph 4 as an incentive on $20 billion a year. One of the things I haven't seen, maybe you see it, is we always talk about how much the annual pharmaceutical drug costs are in America, but no one says how much they would have been if it wasn't for Waxman-Hatch. I'm sure it's taken hundreds of billions out of it annually. And biosimilars will do it, but to a less extent because they're going to be sold at a somewhat higher price. But they will begin moderating the prices of biotech products. But that is how that'll operate here. Is really. So
I think the estimate as of 2011, I want to say, was that that Hatch-Waxman saved roughly $1 trillion in generic costs.
But that's total.
Total.
Yeah. Yep. So what it is annually, but I'm sure it's right. And I think those, that's why when we look at the high price of a given drug, well, first of all, its patent is going to be challenged very soon.
Right.
Secondly, how many years does it really have to go? And can our system, insurance, afford high prices for a few years and then get all the benefits? The benefits are not just financial. The benefits, if you extend the life of a whole generation of people, the value of grandparents is valuable. I really believe in that. And so somehow when we all fixate, it's a politically thing to focus on price of one or two drugs. And by the way, the hepatitis drugs that everybody talked about, some of those are cures. So that means you avoid all the annual costs and all the flare-ups that were going on with hepatitis C. I very rarely see an intelligent discussion of this issue. Of course, there are excesses, many. But
So I don't think anybody up here disagrees with you that there should be some drugs that are expensive and that they're worth it. I think we're saying that, yes, there are some drugs that are expensive and they're worth it, but there are also a bunch of drugs that are expensive that aren't worth it. And we should be better at figuring out how to get more of the first and fewer of the second.
I agree with that. I don't want to delay the whole thing. My take on it is I'd like to see the market do it. I'm a big believer that when government, central government, regulations try to tell people what to charge, what happens is they screw it up because the Soviet Union learned that. But but there are things that are interfering with the intelligent operation of the market. And that's why I mentioned one of them before. I think television drug advertising. Patients walk in and demand drugs from their doctors that are silly and expensive. If we cut out a lot of that stuff, it would be a smaller case. But I agree with that. There are some drugs that are too expensive, and how we help define a market that minimizes those problems is worth thinking a great deal about.
I think when it comes to second further molecular indications of known drugs, I think first of all it's really important to differentiate that from the so-called evergreening debate, or like incremental new uses. I mean, we're really talking about really innovative new uses which have required quite a lot of research, and there I think sometimes it can be very difficult to patent it, and if you can patent it, it's very difficult to enforce these patents, particularly in Europe where you have a special insurance systems and regulatory systems in each country. So in that sense, I'm pretty much astonished about how stiff the regulatory exclusivity system is in that area. So I think there we could maybe, even if it would be, you have to balance that with legal certainty, but I think there's room for some more flexibility in the types of and the duration of exclusivity that you could get for these types of drugs. And in Europe, we have a 8+2+1 system, which is pretty stiff, and I think we could loosen that up and be a little bit more flexible here in having innovative curtailed approaches.
Rachel?
So I think maybe for some of you who don't live in the scholarship the way we do, I want to take a step back and speak a little bit more generally about things like missed opportunities and what we're doing well, which is to say that this discussion we're having now about some drugs are expensive for good reasons and others maybe for not so good reasons, or what should we be doing, we didn't intend to get here. A lot of the regulations or laws that exist in this space were passed for other reasons, other purposes, whether it's about the FDA trying to ensure safety or about insurance trying to assure access, or tax credits being about R&D for particular kinds of companies, not others. These have all resulted in, and so many other different areas, these have all gotten us to the place where we are today, and it's a very complicated situation to think about and to think ourselves out of in some ways. So when Alan is talking about health law versus health policy, it's tough to disaggregate them here because we've been talking about them together for so many years. So it was, in some ways, I would say, a missed opportunity that we didn't think about the impact on innovation of these things we were doing for other very important reasons. But we're getting better and thinking about that now. And the fact that you've got a panel on this topic, the fact that you've got people like us thinking about these issues, I think, is something we're doing better.
Maybe I just want to add, I think also we need to get better in areas where we are getting better now, and that is, for example, rapid responses to crises like the Ebola crisis, the Zika virus crisis, where actually now the authorities are developing kind of systems how we can handle this quicker. And of course, that raises also lots of ethical problems and all kinds of problems, but also I think that the issue of patient involvement. We have now established a Center of Regulatory Sciences in Copenhagen. In our first seminars, we had patient organizations coming in, and patient groups, and how well they are informed, how much input they can give to the drug development process, and especially the licensing process. I mean, that was really amazing. These adaptive licensing ideas, I think, could be very much improved and further developed.
Well, that's a question that does come up, but I'm not sure we'll have time for it. So if you want to say something about adaptive clinical trials, by all means.
That you basically involve the patients before you grant the full approval. You let them have earlier access, in simple words, to the drugs, thereby exposing them for risk. And that, of course, needs to be, or not. I mean, or making them survive the disease. And then I think maybe you could talk about what kind of US system you have in that area, where you have these adaptive licensing approaches.
So yeah, I mean so officially, like, we don't do that, but we do it in certain places. With oncology products, we do it where we allow stuff, Neil knows about this, where we'll allow stuff onto the market based on phase 2 trials with understanding you got to run phase 3 trials, and if the results are negative, we're going to pull you. And that's happened. Right, and so you get stuff like that. And then there's adaptive clinical trial design, which has to do with sort of dosing adjustments to individual patients. And that's like, actually, so it's totally boring, but it's super important because it can allow you to get a lot more data points with a lot fewer patients and get sort of results faster. And that, just in terms of buried innovations, first order in
And
terms
this
of
sort of
importance.
answers the second, what are we doing well? There are some accelerated pathways to approval that is helping the process.
We're starting to experiment with that, which is good. I mean, we need to ask questions like that. We need to be asking questions about, particularly in places where, so there are certain places where just the time to market's too long, and so people cut it out, and so and they just don't do it. And so we could ask, well, what if we sort of shorten it, but then demand data later, and if it's no good, we pull it from the market. And so there's a question like, well, is that acceptable? Like, is it too much of a risk? And the place where we've been flexible there has been with these terminal diseases, because we figure, like, okay, so you give someone with a terminal disease a drug and it doesn't turn out to work. Is that the worst thing in the world? And the answer is no. The worst thing in the world is like shutting down the innovation lines for those people. And then we have to ask questions, like, how good are we at running those phase 3, the sort of post-approval trials, and what are the problems associated with that? Can we enforce those sorts of things?
Right.
And also phase 4, I mean, those commitments often never happen. I mean,
Yeah,
really
that's part of the
market,
design.
that often goes away.
I'll give you one little take on these accelerated programs. And I've been in the position of applying for many. The way it sounds good on paper, most of them sound wonderful. But the way they're actually applied by the different divisions, and it's very much a lot of discretion, and if they will require more and more data, clinical data, well, then it defeats the purpose. Wasn't it supposed to be for a company that just had a little data and didn't have a lot of money, and now you're going to let us either get to the next step, which, like a breakthrough product, you'll get more attention, you'll get help. It's not always you get immediate approval. And what the FDA is generally doing is requiring so much early data that the only companies that can do a 1,000-patient trial in a phase 1 is a big, already wealthy company that frankly doesn't need any help or money or anything else. But the little companies that do need this, they're actually not getting those. So how those accelerated pathways work, there's so much left to discretion, and the risk-averse agencies are applying them in a very limited, restricted way. So I don't think we're getting the full impact of that. That's my take anyway.
And also when it comes to compassionate use, for example, there's of course a problem that parents of, for example, a sick child that are very used in convincing decision makers to take the decision to save that child would of course have an advantage of in comparison to parents who are not so used to do that. So there are a lot of ethical issues there as well. And I think a missed opportunity, at least in Europe, is also the monitoring of already approved drugs, the pharmacovigilance system, where we had a lot of scandals recently. And there we have now improved legislation, but I think there's still much need to make the system more efficient over the the countries over the
And
borders.
this is Ben's point, that if we could really get whatever you call it, phase 4 monitoring or the in-market really doing the studies that they promise that they'll do and many don't do, and then doing them rigorously so that data is meaningful, and then following up and taking drugs off the market that don't meet whatever the criteria was, that would make this system work better, for sure. So moving along, what challenges exist to regulating new health technologies? How should we balance innovation and regulation? I know we've sort of been talking about all of that throughout, but you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah. So one of the challenges that we face is that the laws that exist in this space are mostly very old. So, the definition of drug or device are many decades old, but the FDA is forced to adapt them to new technologies, to new situations all the time. And so one example that I've been studying recently is about diagnostic tests. So for many years, the FDA has chosen not to regulate many diagnostic tests because they were typically simple, done in a doctor's office. We understood the science behind them. But now, as we have diagnostic tests like sort of complex genetic sequencing diagnostics, or things like Myriad's BRCA test, or things like non-invasive prenatal testing, there are safety concerns we may have with these, or efficacy concerns that we didn't have previously. And so it's a challenge for the FDA to decide whether to regulate these at all, and if so, how.
And I think that sort of points out the complexity that's going on, right? Because while you have all that going on, you also have questions and changes in the patent system about how protectable they are under patentable subject matter. And as you have all this particular uncertainty, it's difficult to sort of balance the innovation access sort of dimension when it's sort of in constant flux and the law is like playing catch up to where we perhaps may want it to be.
And this is a great point. Sorry, just to add a little bit. Maybe about 10 years ago, we were in a situation where we had patent protection for these technologies, but we didn't have FDA regulation.
Yeah.
And now we really don't have patent protection, or at least much less. But we probably do have FDA regulation. And there are some companies which are very excited for the FDA regulation because it, in some ways, can compensate for the lack of patent protection, right? If you know
It's a
that
barrier.
the company has
It's
to
a
go
barrier to
through.
entry.
Yeah, but that may be what companies need to encourage them to go through the FDA review process. So, Roche has given the example of a companion diagnostic where the day the drug was on the market, they had a patent, they had an exclusivity period, but the day their diagnostic came to market, they had many competitors. And under the FDA's proposed system, that wouldn't necessarily be true. So innovation and regulation sometimes can oppose each other, but sometimes they can play very well together.
But sometimes it's abused, actually, that regulatory barrier is something that companies actually stimulate sometimes to prevent competition.
Yeah.
All of these things have to be moderated and watched.
So I think the kind of maybe broader version of this challenge is the system's set up to regulate and incentivize stuff, like things, like new drugs or new devices and just physical stuff in the world. And increasingly, I think this has always been true, but I think it's more and more true that the innovation that we want is information that is often untethered from stuff. So, kind of classically, proving that a drug works is the information that you get regulatory exclusivity for, and that's the important thing about the patent. But if you're talking about a second use, that's information that's not tailored to the drug as the initial thing. And medical devices, these diagnostics, if they're about kind of underlying relationships, genetic tests, that's not really tailored to a thing anymore. And so to the extent that we've got a system that's about kind of things in the world, and what we are really, a lot of the action in innovation is information about things in the world, the disconnect between those two, I think, makes everything a little bit harder and everything fit a little bit less well. And in particular, the patent system does a really terrible job with just protecting information, and the regulatory system is slow. Information is fast, and the regulatory system is, let's take a couple of years. And I think that's, at least to my mind, where a decent amount of the mismatch is coming from.
What is interesting right now is that these issues are culminating in the US again after the punch blow from the Myriad, Alice, and Prometheus judgments. We are now having a case that is going, hopefully, to the Supreme Court. because a petition for certiorari has been filed by Sequenom in the Aerosavas Sequenom case. And that is also a case concerning prenatal diagnostics where the patent was invalidated. And that is also a case which is very, very interesting from a comparative perspective, because in Europe, which was always more restrictive before in the area of patent eligibility, actually we have a much more liberal approach right now than the US has in this area. So the Sequenom patent or the European equivalence has been patented by the European Patent Office, and the discussion entirely was unfolding around the issue of inventive step and novelty, not so much patent eligibility. And I think there the US is in need of a more holistic approach, approach which is more deer-like, and the deer judgment for the US Supreme Court, where you would take the invention as a whole, and like the European Union does. And I think there we can learn from each other.
So, any further comments on that? So in the remaining moments, because when I think we're still good? Okay. I'd like to turn to the question, what are some important regulatory innovations in health policy? And they give, as an example, FDA's acceptance of surrogate endpoints. Any comments?
No. So so the surrogate endpoint stuff is important. There's actually a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of it falls in the same kind of bucket, which is to what extent do we want to be more flexible in terms of the standards we're putting on for production of evidence as a pre-market approval process. Surrogate endpoints is just an example of that, where there's some evidence and we think it's like telling, so we sort of suspect this thing works, but we don't know for sure. When is that enough? Like, when do we accept that? This has been going on for a long time with the FDA. So like whether or not to accept lowered blood pressure as an endpoint for cardiovascular stuff. The cardiovascular unit in the FDA held up for a long time on that, and the diabetes unit in the FDA started accepting them way earlier, which is just interesting. Cholesterol with oncology is a big deal, and so there's just and I did some research where we actually found sort of pretty important effects in terms of innovation incentives when you allow surrogates, but we were only looking in places where the surrogates turned out to be true, and we saw these huge sort of societal benefits in the order of like $1 trillion net present value so with oncology, with the hematologic drugs, we're using sort of this blood test as a surrogate. But that doesn't tell us the real important question, which is like, how much uncertainty should we be willing to accept? And I was at an Institute of Medicine conference a little bit ago, and we were talking about these sorts of things. And I actually thought Janet Woodcock, who sort of the FDA, had the most intelligent point here, was because people were kind of freaking out about it, and she was just like, look, we just need to be able to sit down and have a grown-up conversation. She sits in the middle of this stuff, and she's, there's like people that are pushing, saying we really need to have these things, and other people freaking out, saying no, we're like, we'll die because, and it's like, well, we just need to sit down and say like, how much uncertainty are we willing to take under what circumstances? So that's.
It's still, for somebody trying to get approvals, it's impossible. There was a big multi-thousand patient study in the New England Journal of Medicine that said for acute myeloid leukemia, complete remission in the induction cycle, I won't go into what that means, virtually guarantees much longer survival than anything else. If you don't have complete remission in your induction cycle, the odds are very small you're going to survive. So can we use that as an endpoint? Every physician who practices this wants it. FDA will not accept it. You have to go for overall survival before you'll get an approval, which guarantees an extra 4 years of development, patients not getting the medicine. And in 5 years, they're going to reluctantly agree. But at the moment, it's frustrating. But I mean, these are progress that they're talking about, surrogate endpoints, but it's an area that's...
Well, it's interesting because, so it turns out this happens in medical practice all the time, where there's some evidence and it suggests something, but you don't have the definitive conclusion, and practicing physicians sort of make a judgment. They say, yep, that's enough, I'm going to start doing it. And then, it turns out that the point at which the vast majority of practicing physicians, including specialists, are going to make a decision is very different from the point where the FDA is going to make that decision. And you get circumstances where the FDA Medical Advisory Board says no, like we're not doing this. And then but they're all specialists, and you ask them, how many of you are prescribing this to your patients for this? Like all of them. Like they're all on board, but we actually have a different standard for what the FDA standards are, and we take those very seriously. There's sort of reasons why we do that, but there's also places where there's a lot of tension surrounding that, and we need to have a grown-up conversation.
Absolutely. Good. I would like to jump in the minute before we're going to come to the final question. What can we learn from innovation policy outside the U.S., particularly in Europe, which areas are not really comparable internationally? So, Timo, if I can start with you.
Well, yeah. Well, what do you mean by Europe? European Union or each member state? Because it's quite complex.
Yes, you're right.
Well, in the patent eligibility area, I think the US could look at Europe if the US Supreme Court would be interested to see. And I think also in the antibiotics area, I think the GAIN Act in the US, I think it's called, was it GAIN? Yeah, I think that one was pretty much influenced by European approaches. But I also think the question is also what can Europe learn from the US? And I think there we have an amazing collaboration going on between the EMA and the FDA, and there are many areas where they actually are following each other, are harmonizing their approaches, and for example in the clinical trials data transparency area, where there's still a lot of weak spots, I think, but it's a laudable goal. I think we just need to take care of the risks, and in that areas I think there's much room for cross-fertilization. What more?
Well,
yes,
some things that where it's not particularly relevant or a good analogy.
Well, of course, we talked about the insurance systems in Europe, and for me, the way this works in the US is, for me, it's difficult to understand why some EU citizens think that the Obamacare system is a bad idea. Maybe the complexity of the system had some negative impact, but I think from a European perspective, we like our healthcare system very much, and I think there we have a lot of things to learn from each other. Maybe also in the area of testing or requiring proof of efficiency of a drug. Because in Germany, the authorities that require that the pharma company shows the efficiency, and is also having a saying in the pricing of the drug. And I think there we have some innovative approaches which could be useful to look at.
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. By the way, one of my favorites, we have a 5-year NCE exclusivity in the US. In Europe, they have 10. I think it would be a tremendous advantage because a lot of the patent issues that, second uses or all kinds of issues, if we could just calibrate closer to what you have in Europe, it avoids a lot of some of the other challenges of patent law. But I think we're almost at the point, or past the point where I'm supposed to address the final question. What is the most important contribution that the Petri Flom Center and its affiliates have made so far regarding health innovation policy and regulating novel technology? And where could the center have the biggest impact moving forward? Any thoughts, Melissa?
Well, that's, I think, obviously a difficult question. I think one of the things I think that's amazing about the center is the interdisciplinary aspect to the work that occurs here, right? And that you can go to conferences and there are economists and there's doctors and there's people who are working in the pharmaceutical industry that bring that together. And I think there are lots of centers and law schools that aspire to do that type of bridge, but very, very few, I think, that are as successful as the Petri Flom Center has been in that. And I think it's much more difficult than individuals sort of think. And I think that the Petri Flom Center has done that amazingly well. I also think that innovation in the healthcare industry is necessarily going to take individuals from all these different fields coming together to help solve solutions for that. And so I would say that's one of the areas I think that the Petri Flom Center has really excelled at.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you see that in kind of the individual scholarship of the people on this podium among other people from the Petrie-Flom Center, which is to say, there's been a long tradition of, are drug patents good? Yay, like new drugs. Or are drug patents bad? Boo, problems for access. And I think there's a lot more scholarship now, a decent amount of it concentrated here, which says, well, drugs are, patents are a part of the picture, but there's also regulatory exclusivity and insurance incentives and time to market and the administrative law, the PTO, and all of these things that fit together in a really complicated picture. And figuring out how the different levers interact, identifying them and figuring out how they interact in one kind of overall picture, I think is an important thing that's come out of, it hasn't come out of the Petrie-Flom Center, it's other places too, but I think there's a really big concentration of it in kind of PFC folks, and I think that's something that's going to become more important going forward. It's a complicated system.
Yeah, so I think Amanda maybe on a previous panel used the term agenda setting. I think the fact that Petrie-Flom has decided this is an important area meriting a whole panel on an event like this, I don't think it would have been possible 5-10 years ago to do this. And the scholarly conversation has really changed. And to put institutional backing and support behind what Nicholson is describing, we've only complicated the situation. We haven't yet offered solutions. But we are declaring that this is important, I think has been a huge step forward already.
Yeah. So I would say the people on the stage here are kind of the product, and so we end up creating the next generation of the sort of law school faculty in this space. Which before you had kind of health law scholars and you had patent law scholars, and then there was a very small number, you count them on like less than one hand, of patent law scholars who kind of migrated into this space, but they were sort of spread out, and it was just a little thing, and it's the product of the Petrie-Flom Center. It's us.
Yeah, I've only been here for 3 months for family reasons, and I have to say, I was amazed by the interdisciplinary input I got here, and I'm convinced that this is the only way forward. The collaboration with the Broad Institute, with the Harvard Medical School, the Portal Institute, where Aaron Kesselheim, for example, I met Aaron Kesselheim, and this what you also pointed out, this interdisciplinarity is the only way forward, and that we develop our channels of communicating and doing research together, and also maybe trying to involve more economics, because I think, as our keynote speaker, that this is really crucial. We need better evidence. And for better evidence, we need transparency to make reasonable decisions for the future. And that is, I think, here's the place where we can get that.
Thank you. Speaking again is from the industry point of view. On the last question, moving forward, whether Petrie-Flom, you've said a number of very interesting things about pharmaceutical pricing. I hear too much political people talking about it that don't know what they're talking about. If you were to do some research or write something to educate the dialogue, the discussion that's taking place today about pricing, it might, and all of its aspects, not just higher price. I don't mean that. Fully discuss it so that we have a more informed decision makers who will be addressing that issue in the future. Okay, please. Introduce yourself, please.
Einer Elhaig.
Okay.
So my questions actually pick up off your last two questions, which is, on a couple of issues, it seemed to me some of you were too modest about the contributions of your own work, so I want to ask a couple of questions to encourage you to say more about it. So one topic we had was whether or not health insurance screws up the innovation process because it makes prices unrelated to how people aren't paying the full price. But there is this counter view, right? So the counter view is, in most markets, monopoly pricing results in prices way above marginal cost, and so we underconsume the innovation. It doesn't get disseminated enough. And one nice thing about healthcare is that because of insurance, there's this argument that the amount of the co-payment is approximately equal to the marginal cost, and so actually insurance solves the under-dissemination problem. I associate this most with Ben Rowan's work. So the first question is insurance really a bug or a feature for healthcare innovation? The other question had to do with the topic that came up about why is it that we get so many incremental improvements in ameliorating chronic diseases rather than cures? And part of the answer may simply be for the same reason that Willie Sutton robbed banks. That's where the money is. So it's much better you can make a lot more money treating a chronic disease for 20, 30 years than you can curing a disease and killing your market immediately. So one possibility might be to have insurers actually pay more on a value basis and try to pay much more for cures and a lot less for incremental improvements. I associate this most with Rachel's work. So the question for that would really be, how do we make that administrable? How can we get insurers to really pay on that basis, especially given that for cures, it'll result often in what feel like shockingly high prices, I think, for a short period of time. And it'll also lead to a lot of political problems with I think, drug manufacturers for paying a lot less for treatment of chronic diseases.
I could start on the sort of insurance point. So I don't know if I can take credit for that. So there were economists who were sort of making this point. I was building on it. But so one thing that's worth paying attention to with respect to insurance coverage for prescription drugs is that it increases access. That's the fund. That's why we have it. And that deals with the central problem that we think that we get from patents, which is high prices. And it sort of deals with it in the same way as the systems we kind of imagine and dream up that would lead us to the social ideal. It's like these prize systems or whatever. They're functionally, they're like mechanically, they're operating incredibly similarly. But I would add something else to that, which is that the discussions about insurance messing up demand have always struck me as kind of interesting because they kind of like imagine a world where we didn't have insurance and we just we decided how much we were willing to pay for each drug. You go to the doctor and the doctor would say, and you say, well, what am I willing to pay for that? And I can't get myself over hump saying, well, the answer for me, in almost like all cases, would be I have no idea because I don't know its value because I'm not a doctor. And I would have to do like a ton of research, and even then, like it would be hard to figure that out. And that's just part of the nature of the goods we're buying, which is that their value is hard to observe. Like that's why we have all this regulation. Their value is hard to observe as a consumer. So we have clinical trials. It's hard to draw causal inference in this place, and we don't know the effects. And so you rely on doctors. And so you think about, well, what is one of the things insurance companies do? And one of the really important things they do is try to figure out how much they're willing to pay for stuff. And when the system's operating properly, and it does in a bunch of places, the insurance company sits down and says, and they negotiate with the provider and say, look, we're not going to pay that, we'll pay this. And it's based in part on production of evidence of what the value is. And you think, well, so is that better? So if I was in those same shoes, would I come up with a better answer for what's the price for Sovaldi or something like that? No. I would come up with a way worse answer. Like, what's the proper price for Lipitor when it's on patent, when it's off patent? Like, what am I willing to pay for those things? I have no idea. What am I willing to pay for a colonoscopy? I have no idea. Because I don't know. But the insurance company is going to come up with an answer. And is that going to be the perfect answer? I don't know. But is it going to be better than the answer that individuals with very limited information are going to have? And the answer might be yes. And so there's this other thing they're doing too. And so we think about insurance and how it messes up the market. And I've always found those conversations very kind of in some sense, just one-sided. And that they apply kind of a classic, well, there's moral hazard, and so we don't, and the price got out of control, and they're ignoring, I think, a lot of the reality on the ground, which is that these operatives who we hire negotiate on our behalf over prices, and they do it with a lot of information, with a lot of experts, and they do it in bulk. So they're representing a whole bunch of consumers, not just one.
So I love this question, unsurprisingly, and I want to actually bring it back to something you talked about earlier, which is fragmentation, right? One of the problems we have with paying for cures, paying for something like Sovaldi, is that even if you think it's very cost effective, it's like buying a house with cash rather than paying off a mortgage over time. And if you've got someone on Medicaid and the savings from the drug won't accrue until that person is on another insurance system or even Medicare, there are problems for the incentives of insurers in being willing to pay for things like that. So people are trying to come up with creative ways to encourage maybe payments over time for things like that. But I think Sovaldi is sort of the perfect example here because it's a drug we, in some sense, shouldn't have, right? It cures a chronic disease that's prevalent largely among poor and marginalized populations, and so the fact that we have a cure for it is wonderful. I saw a crazy article the other day which said something like Gilead's big problem is that it might cure everyone of hepatitis C. And my thought was, wouldn't that be great, right?
Absolutely.
So we should be encouraging this, not fearing the results if Gilead succeeds.
Well, one question would be, how many years are left on the patent? We were saying it, but if let's imagine it's 6 years or 7, someone might say it's worth 7 years to the collective insurance figure out how to divide it among you, because you're going to save billions more over the length of time. Some of this is, it's not that the product is so high priced, it's that they haven't figured out how to share the cost, because it's a good thing for the reason you said. And if they hadn't had that high price, maybe they would never have developed that drug.
Well, there will be people online who will yell at me unless I say that Gilead didn't develop it, they purchased it, they in-licensed it by buying another smaller company. So there's a lot of interesting
No, I believe
here.
that. I believe
Yeah.
that anything you can do to help the smaller companies, that's where innovation is. That's why when the FDA requires more data and a little company can't afford it, they're forcing the little company into the hands of the big company. I think the source of pharmaceutical innovation, biotech innovation today, and for years has been the small companies. And we need to have a system that they can work with. We have to not lose sight of that. But that's a very good point.
So I wanted to ask about off-label promotion and its effects on innovation, in particular the current assault by the First Amendment purists on FDA. So one way of framing the question is, if the Supreme Court were to adopt the district court's opinion in Amarin or the Second Circuit in Coronia as their own, what would happen in terms of distortions or changes to the incentives to innovate?
So I think right now, not a lot, because I think the fact that the Second Circuit, so for those of you who don't follow this, the Second Circuit basically said off-label promotion, go for it. First Amendment protects it, knock yourself out. And so the fact that the Second Circuit said that, and any drug company can kind of run to the Second Circuit and get an injunction if FDA is threatening them, I think means that as a legal matter, the Supreme Court adopting it, frankly, would make very little difference. As a practical matter, FDA still has a giant stick, so it beats them into the ground sometimes if they're doing really bad things. So I don't think that would, as like a process, they make a big difference. In terms of the overall effect on innovation, I think this ties in with the question about how much are drug companies willing to spend on developing information on second uses when patent protection for them is pretty lousy. Regulatory exclusivity doesn't make much of a difference. I think the answer is they're not putting as much into this as we would like. We would like higher quality information. The current regime doesn't do a whole lot to drive that forward, but frankly, it hasn't for a while now. Sounds pessimistic.
So
I would just add that, so for the length of the patent, the originator company now can promote off-label. They might even have motivation to do some more studies so they can get some handouts of studies they've done to generate higher sales of their product. But what happens when the patent expires? It goes to one of the things that Ben is working on. We have to encourage, there may be many other off-label uses that will never get developed because once the patent is off, generics are there and there's no incentive. And we need a system to encourage that. And it won't necessarily be by the originator company. It'll be by other companies using 505(b)(2) and accessing the data. But the system is not perfect. That only answers part of the thing. First Amendment makes sense. And we should let doctors and patients know about other uses of a drug. But let's try to develop further even additional uses and have an incentive to find that information out so that more people can benefit from most of the drugs that are already been demonstrated. Their safety profile has been established. They're much further along. You don't have to redo the preclinical. It's so much logic in developing drugs that have already been developed for one use for other things. And this is only a partial answer to that in these cases.
And I think it's worth noting a couple of other options beyond just the court system. So there are sort of private ordering solutions. So if an insurance company doesn't want to pay for an off-label use, it might be that they don't have to. If they can figure out, right, this is Ben's work again, what's an off-label use and what's not an off-label use. One response is you can use that to force companies to do exactly this kind of research. And then another is the FDA has maybe some amount of soft power they can use if they know that companies are going to be looking to do this on the back end. They can alter the terms on which they'll approve these drugs and require more and different kinds of studies on the front end.
I would just throw in quickly. So one of the things it's already happened in this space is that FDA regulations are supplemented or supplanted by prior authorization insurance regulations. So insurers controlling what prescribers can and can't do. And like in a lot of places, that can have a huge effect on, and does have a huge effect on incentives to do marketing, including off-label marketing, because if the insurance company isn't covering it, the bang for your buck for trying to encourage doctors to prescribe it for that is extremely limited, so they can enforce it. So you might actually, so in some sense, instead of getting a sort of an FDA standard, you have a less well-defined, insurer standard for how much evidence is enough for us to be willing to cover this. And it actually is an interesting dynamic because it also reflects price potentially. But there are places where that's not really true because insurers have a hard time controlling what doctors are doing. And in those places, it's like getting rid of FDA control, it starts to look a little bit more like the Wild West. But it's sort of a different Wild West than what we're used to because we harken back to what it was like before the FDA had these standards. We're kind of imagining a very different medical profession than what we have now. One that's really been trained in evidence-based medicine, that sort of stuff. And so it's like it probably wouldn't look the same, but it certainly would look different. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question.
But by the way, it's not just additional uses for products that have been genericized. What about a drug that has, because the company didn't have enough money, it never gets approved the first time, or they went and developed it for the wrong indication and that failed. But this drug, there's a lot of data about it. It really probably works for 10 other things, but the patent is expired. The same issues relate to it, and actually there's probably a lot of value in those drugs.
But if it's never been approved,
no, it's never been approved.
I would think that you would you wouldn't have exactly the same problem.
No, it's not exactly the same, but
because
it's never been approved, and the patent has expired.
Yeah,
so
but you could get a patent on a new use, or you could try to get a patent for the use, and then you don't have the generic and off-label prescribing.
Patents, frankly, are so completely overrated. It's amazing. Because as soon as you established, went through the expense of showing it really worked, now people would say it probably works for 3 other things. They quickly get an approval, and you'd have competitors sell. Or if you try to develop it in a different formulation or a different dosage form, compounding pharmacies, it's impossible to enforce use patents. I can speak for the industry. When a product is coming to the end of its life, no one says, oh, we'll continue developing it because we'll have a use patent. You abandon it. It's not worth the economics are not justified. However, a lot of good products die because of that.
Well, that's because you're in a situation in which things like the exclusivity period have already run. If it hasn't been approved at all, then at least you've got some period of time. If it's biologic, maybe you've already got another 12 years you could be looking at going forward.
Well, that's right. If you had the 12 years for a biologic, that would...
because I don't want to
longer than many.
We're running...
This is the next break, see if we can get through the queues.
Yeah, so let's go. Yes,
Thank you for waiting, everybody. So my name is Darby Hall, and I just wanted to bring up the data sharing point that you raised, Timo, because I know with the French clinical trial disaster in January, there were a lot of calls for data sharing to increase for phase 1 human subjects in particular. But also, I know on the other side, it makes the IP people a little queasy. So you said that data sharing, and especially if FDA and EMA harmonize their regulations, that could lead to some cross-fertilization, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, increased clinical trial transparency has, of course, many benefits. One benefit is to detect risks earlier, but also to allow better collaboration in cross-border clinical trials and to allow for a better system for finding further medical indications and for spreading the information about the drug, of course. And of course, that has implications on the later patentability, because in some situations, once the information is out there, it would be impossible to fulfill the novelty or inventive step criteria for patenting a new use of a drug. And the current system transparency initiatives in the US and Europe, they take some kind of account of that, but I think not enough, because this information is globally available, but not in all countries there is a same regulatory exclusivity system. And the question is, how can we make sure that we have an or kind of reasonable exclusivities still available for these kinds of drugs that are not patentable anymore because information is out there. I think still that the entire initiative of transparency is necessary. It's a laudable initiative, but I think it has to be thought through very carefully. And I think maybe Nicholson also has to add something, because you wrote on that in Nature Biotech.
Well, I wrote on that with you.
Yes, that's true.
So I pretty much agree with what Timo just said. I think, yes. Well done. Well said.
Okay, I thought maybe I had something to add. Yes, please.
So I have a question about the recent cancer moonshot, whether that hurts innovation or helps it. Before I get to that, I did want to remark about Judy Flom's earlier talk. I was privileged to work with Joe Flom. It was my first job out of after my clerkship, after graduating from here. And he was a builder. He had a choice, having a small, elite-focused firm or building a global firm. And he built a global firm, which meant sharing the wealth with a lot of other attorneys. And I think I see it here, too. What he's building here in his legacy is really terrific and really bespeaks that attitude towards incorporation and building something great and lasting. But back to Joe Biden and the cancer moonshot. Vice President Biden has gone around to many institutions around the country and now has over 200 interlocutors that he is going to work with to figure out what to do with this program. He came to Seattle and really froze the audience of researchers there by saying that the real focus is going to be on data sharing and big data. And this terrifies the academic in the lab who's built his or her entire career on hoarding data until the last possible moment and then getting richly rewarded for that hoarding. And they may have $1 billion delivered by the federal government into this program, which can maybe produce one drug if focused on one drug, and now he's got 220 interlocutors. So it's an open question in my mind whether or not this was a good idea or a distraction for those in cancer research. And I just wanted to get your views on whether this is the sort of thing, this sort of government one-off program would help innovation or actually hinder it.
So, do you want to?
Sure. So first I have to say that I see my students in the back smiling because we discussed this in class a couple of weeks ago. And the ability of the government to declare that something is a priority and that there needs to be a focus on it can be very, very powerful in attracting attention, not just from government, right? As you say, $1 billion will not will not be sufficient to establish a cure for cancer. But if that $1 billion of public funding comes with focus by a whole range of academic scientists, by a focus of smaller companies and big companies, it can have a multiplier effect. So I think it depends, unfortunately. I think it's not clear what the result will be, but it has great potential. And I think one thing it's actually done is, as you say, it's exploded this debate about research data and data sharing. So witness the recent fights in the New England Journal of Medicine about what do you call it, data parasites, research parasites, and these kinds of terms that we're using to talk about fellow scholars, right, who maybe we should be working together more than we are, and it's in some sense really about the norms of the scientific community.
So I want to push back a little bit on your first point.
I didn't say anything, so that's great.
I mean, the first point, like, we've got the government saying this is a really important thing. Like, Curing cancer? We've known curing
Yeah,
cancer was a
true.
really important thing for a long time. We've had the government say, we're going to cure cancer, like several times before. It's a big deal. I don't think this is a surprise initiative.
Yeah.
Now, as to whether or not it'll make a difference for innovation, you got the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which put a giant bolus of money into kind of NIH funding. And what that meant was you hired a bunch of postdocs, and the funding went away. And then all the new labs that were funded emptied out because nobody can afford them. And it just screwed everything up for a while. I mean, it's potentially great. I could see it actually being great from a big data perspective and from an infrastructure perspective if what they do is lay the groundwork for future work. And High Tech Act gets a bunch of flack for trying to do electronic health records in meaningful use, but now doctors have computers. So if what they do is say the cancer moonshot, we're not actually going to cure the hundreds of different types of cancer, but what we might do is create some data sharing initiatives so that people work better going forward, yeah, that could make a difference.
So Ben, I wanted to follow up on your comment about the function of insurance as essentially standing in and helping you make a decision about whether or not something's worth it. And so trying to draw on the theme of what the US may or may not be able to learn from Europe. So now that I'm in the UK, we have this agency who makes such determinations. So the NICE both performs a cost-benefit analysis and determines whether or not a given treatment is worth it by reference to the quality-adjusted life years that a given treatment will provide. So if it's around 20,000 pounds per quality is safe. If you're under 20, you're fine. If you're over 20, you get into scrutiny. So anyway, the question is, so under this model, that decision is both centralized, transparent, and has a direct impact on what care you can receive. So would any one of those three things, or all of them, be good to incorporate? Because as you were talking, it occurred to me, well, insofar as what the insurance companies are doing isn't transparent, I'm not totally sure they can serve the function you identified, and which got me to thinking about whether any of these other features of the UK model, which has not only transparency, but also centralization, so it's not the insurance company doing it, it's the government, and then actually tying that to what care you can receive, and whether or not we could even imagine a healthcare system where your bronze, silver, and gold insurance policies are tied to what sort of quality level you're willing to pay for. So if you want treatments that cost 50,000 pounds or $50,000 per quality, you have to pay for gold. So any thoughts on?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, so I don't have an answer to like what's the optimal design for an insurance system, but the comparison's right. So you've got the NICE system, which does it transparently, and they're kind of the only ones in Europe who do it that way. Everyone else is closer to the US system where it's all done under the table, and it's hard to see exactly what's happening. Except in the US, it's more decentralized because we don't have instead of having one sort of national system that does it, we do it through private insurers. Now, of course, there's been tremendous consolidation in those markets. So the PBMs, there's like 2 PBMs that represent like 65% of the US population or something like that. So it's pretty centralized, but nonetheless, so we have competition in that space, and then the question is, well, what does that look like exactly? So and this just ties back to, I think, one of the very first things I said. Here's what I think is great about this, and this is not an answer to your question, but just sort of an encouragement for the inquiry. If we want to know what's wrong with the market and places where we should be intervening, we should be like asking these exact questions and then going down the rabbit hole and saying, well, okay, what's going on through this? This is the process that sort of determines demand. So if we think prices are too high, there's got to be some sort of dysfunction on the demand side, and that's largely being determined by insurers. Is there something going on in that process that's leading to a point of dysfunction? And so you can imagine all sorts of things going on with NICE where they mess up their calculations, and we actually see that a bunch. Sometimes quite openly, like they just have limited data. Other times they're making odd decisions, or there's just the 20,000 pounds thing, which is like, is that really the right number? Because it's actually very different from the number that so if you're an economist, you put on the value of a life year, something like that. On the private insurance side, we can say things because private insurers, it's not like they have the perfect incentives to do everything exactly the way we as their customers would want them to do. So are there places where they're deviating from what we want? And those can be places where they're maybe underpaying or not covering stuff that they really should be, as we were talking about, like sometimes maybe preventative stuff. But there's also could be places where they sort of lose control vis-a-vis the doctors, and the doctors can and then so maybe you get prices that are too high. And so really sort of focusing on that in terms of understanding where should we be intervening. That's not an answer to your question, but that's what I'm sort of excited about.
We have to leave it at that. So
I would just want to say that generally in our industry, speaking as an industry person, we regard all the pricing done mechanisms in Europe as artificial because every company, English pharmaceutical company, European, Asian, are developing drugs for the US market. And once they get it approved here, they may as well sell it at whatever prices they can get in Canada and Japan and Europe. However, that doesn't mean that if we had, in the US, we had such a system, we'd have to see if it was still effective to produce new drugs. But I'm not saying it's a bad system. I'm saying it's at the moment not a real market. We don't have a way of demonstrating that system produces drugs.
please join me in thanking this panel.